It's interesting because many of us that work in diversity, equity, inclusion work for global corporates. And if we work for a global corporate, that presents a number of really quite unique challenges in comparison to working for a domestic company. So if we outline, what the top kind of 3 or 4 of those are, well, the first one is actually around data collection. So there's different legal frameworks operating actually across Europe, North America, Asia, etc., that allows us to either collect data on protected groups, or there's some legal frameworks that says actually you are legally not supposed to be collecting data. So that creates a bit of a unique challenge, because actually if we're trying to create systems and strategies and processes which are consistent, actually we don't always have consistency in terms of the information that we need to help us to do that. So I think data collection is a unique challenge when you're working with a global corporate. I think the second one is almost around what we might call kind of cross-cultural communication and cross-cultural kind of capabilities and competencies. We know that we are all vulnerable to stereotypes, bias, etc., those assumptions that we make. So communicating with colleagues, from different cultures, different cultural norms, different ways of working, different styles, that can create some challenges if we're not clued up on what those cultural nuances are, and we're not competent enough to be able to flex ourselves to deal with them. And I think operationally, there's some unique challenges as well. And I think one of them is just being aware of the kind of different time zones that we're working on, and the kind of the way that we kind of connect together. So how do we create collaboration, effective flow of information when we are working, different time zones, working agilely, working kind of, using electronic communication like Teams and stuff like that. And that's a different style of connecting with colleagues than if you're all in a room together and the rest of it. So I think there's quite a lot of unique challenges, but they're the kind of key ones that we definitely need to start, thinking about as a base one start point. If we're working across cultures and in multinational teams, I think we've got to be sensible to say that, in many ways we want a global D&I strategy and a global vision. But because we've got local nuances, we've really got to make sure that our strategies are flexible enough to adapt to local cultures, needs, and the rest of it. And that might be looking at your local market. So we might say if you're operating in one jurisdiction, the talent pool that you have is different from the talent pool that you're dealing with in a different market. So that plays out in terms of, okay, well, what does our talent attraction process look like? So I think we've got to think about that employee life cycle. So what does that talent attraction process look like? We do know that different markets have different policies, processes, even like cultural attitudes around things like parental care. So how, if we have a global policy on things like maternity and paternity care, how do we make sure that we operationalize those locally when some countries have quite sophisticated legislation around that and others less so? And so I think they're the kind of things that we need to think about. And then I think the final thing to add in would be around, I suppose, cultural attitudes. And I think the honesty of this is that there are some cultures currently that may have a value set which might not align to the values of the organization. So, in some jurisdictions, legislation around women's rights, around LGBTQ plus rights is not where we would want it to be. So that creates some particular challenges that we can't always globalize for. We have to take that into account when we're developing that local strategy. So there's a lot of nuance that we need to flex in to make sure that we've got a global vision but has local application. If we recognize that, different cultures have different ways of seeing the world, different legal frameworks, etc., I guess the big question is, well, how do we navigate that? How do we navigate the complexity of life and all of that? And I think the way that we could navigate that in some ways, despite it being quite complex, is relatively simple. And the simplicity comes down to something about values. So let's imagine a world where there's no legal protection whatsoever. There's no equality laws and all of that stuff has gone away. Well, how do we create a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of psychological safety? And for me, it comes down to corporate values and personal values. What is it that you stand for? how do we expect our employees to think and to act when they're in the workplace? And so if you're working within a set of cultures that have different biases and ways of seeing the world, we can create a common expectation of behavior through an alignment of values. So if we have a value around respect, what does respect look like in terms of a set of behaviors? So regardless of where you are, regardless of where you work, regardless of your cultural background, regardless of the stereotypes that you have, we expect your behaviors to align to this principle of respect. And I think that's an interesting way where we can start to navigate some of the complexities around, this topic.